Part 3, Reading in the Original. Mitchell's comparative approach, in which we are asked to see how the logic of transnational circulation places characters, episodes, and even sentences within multiple containers, suggests new directions for literary critical methodology. Historians of the transnational novel will need to analyze how a work participates not only in one literary system, the literary system of the language in which it was composed, but also in the other literary systems in which it has a presence. The history of born-translated literature, I've argued, requires the history of many books, excerpts, anthologies, editions, and translations. Thinking about the history of many books leads to a practice I've called close reading at a distance, because it draws our attention to the relationship between production and circulation on a global scale, and because it asks us to think about how literature written for the world establishes uniqueness, indeed locality, in novel ways. Writing in the journal Novel, Peter MacDonald has argued that the history of many books should not be seen as one approach among many, but rather as the essential precondition for understanding the aesthetic strategies of works that imagine themselves globally. MacDonald's approach involves acknowledging that what is putatively outside the text, its covers, its typography and pagination, its author's name, informs the inside. For his part, MacDonald seems uncertain whether the turn to the geopolitics of readers and publishers negates, alters, or simply supplements traditional reading practices. First, echoing generations of book historians, he says that particular readers find themselves face to face not with the words on the page, but with a richly coded artifact that bears witness to multiple intersecting histories. But later, he insists, the point, however, is not to privilege the book above the words on the page. Like many contemporary critics, MacDonald stumbles over and repeats a familiar opposition between the book and the word, between the broad analysis of literature's economic, political, and physical histories, and the deep analysis of a single work's rhetorical properties. It is not surprising that he repeats this formulation, since it has come to seem axiomatic that close reading involves paying attention above all to the very smallest units of a text. Close reading may involve attention to details, as Jonathan Culler and Jane Gallup have argued in recent articles, but what are details? How large are they? How do we know when we have attended to them intensively, substantially, or as we say, deeply? And finally, what if we define close reading, as John Guillory has proposed, less by its objects than by its practice, where it is not the deep attention to words, but the deep attention itself that matters most? As I've suggested in this talk, born-translated works often proceed from the fiction, sometimes the fact, that readers are encountering an original translation, a work that has begun in several languages, or a work that has been composed in one language and then published in a foreign tongue. These works can't expect us to read and to master the words on the page, since on some level attending to all of the words and all of the pages would involve reading many more editions than we could hold in our hands, or would involve reading an edition that doesn't really exist. Instead, they ask us to focus on the text's resistance to mastery, or what I've called fluency, at the level of theme, characterization, plot, structure, and genre. Foreignness operates diegetically and narratively much more than it does semantically. So in The Thousand Autumns, the location of the text is irreducible to any one beginning or geography, and in fact, we are asked to think about the geopolitical, commercial, topographic, historical, linguistic, and meteorological relations that govern the meaning of place. Because the text starts in circulation, it literally begins by reflecting on the multilingual origins of Japanese obstetrics. We have to conceive of its community as something we discover rather than as a linguistic, territorial, or political entity concurrent with either author or reader. As an intellectual strategy, close reading at a distance overlaps with two major developments in transnational literary studies. First, the turn towards books in the study of texts, and second, the effort to challenge, historicize, transform, and in some cases reject dominant practices of close reading. Perhaps the most influential critic in this regard is Franco Moretti, whose model of distant reading involves tracking the way groups of literary works travel from their national origin into new spaces and languages. Like close reading at a distance, distant reading calls for new objects of attention, and it imagines collaborations among scholars rather than one person's knowledge of every relevant language. However, distant reading presupposes someone else's traditional close reading of individual works. The synthetic calculations at the heart of distant reading are based on other readers' analyses of voice and idiom, on the comparison of national literary histories, and on the assumption that all literary texts begin in a unique language. If Moretti's project separates the analysis of literary circulation from the analysis of literary production, Daniel Hack's related approach suggests that transnational book history can coexist with close reading if we hew to linguistic rather than national frameworks. He shows, for example, how a 19th century British work such as Bleak House developed new cultural meanings and political uses when it was serialized in US anti-slavery periodicals. Through commentary, dramatization, and rewriting, Hack argues the African Americanization of Bleak House created new Bleak Houses. Hack also calls his methodology close reading at a distance, but his procedure involves something more like distant reading up close, since he is interested above all in the dynamics of reception, how an original text with intrinsic features travels from one political context to another, and how it is deployed in each of those contexts. Comparing Afterlife with original new US versions with the version that Dickens published in Britain, Hack follows Moretti's model in which texts start in one place and then move out to others. Because they affirm national literary histories in order to compare them, distant reading and even distant reading up close might be best understood as methodologies suited to specific literary works and literary genres, namely those that affirm localism and a sharp distinction among literary geographies. For our purposes, the key innovation in Hack's work is the sense that readers may have to think of any text as one version among many. It is here that the turn to books in transnational literary studies most overlaps with new theories of reading that have called for alternatives to critical distance and mastery, both of which conceive of the reader as a disinterested authority who stands outside of the text, comprehends it, and speaks its language. Yet even critics who remain committed to suspicion have tried to disaggregate the identification of puzzles in the text from the effort to solve them. Jane Gallup has written eloquently against the notion of the reader as puzzle solver or authority. Gallup describes her own practice of reading each word as if it were foreign or in some way inaccessible. She thus imagines herself not as a master interpreter, but as a translator, even when she is reading in a native tongue. Because she seeks to keep herself and her students from comprehending too quickly and from identifying the sort of book they have before them, she associates the function of closeness with disruption of groups and categories. Best, Marcus, Buse, and Gallup, for all of their differences, insist that readers need to pay attention above all to the details of the literary work, while also making a greater effort to consider the institutional, political, and literary historical frameworks that have shaped current methodologies. How might born translated novels change this calculus? Because they shift the locus of stubbornness and puzzlement from the smallest units of the text to units of various scales, they require us to analyze closely and deeply a greater range of details than traditional close reading has required. And because they feature narratives that seem to have begun in many different languages, they ask us to think about the political dynamics of foreignness, and especially about the foreignness that is internal to any multilingual collectivity. Born translated novels do not ignore details, but they ask us to conceive of details more broadly and more variously than we have in the recent past, as those parts of the text of potentially any scale or size that seem prosaic, beneath notice, or simply mechanical. This approach has the benefit of allowing us to attune our reading strategies to the strategies of our literary texts, and to acknowledge that reading strategies can, in effect, produce texts, insofar as, say, reading for the plot will tend to single out for praise or for notice those works in which plot is emphasized. Understanding details broadly also has the benefit of acknowledging the intellectual history of details, in which expectations about thematic and semantic meaningfulness have changed and continue to change. Because it emphasizes details that have seemed too large, too functional, or too irrelevant to justify sustained analysis, close reading at a distance participates in the long recovery of what Naomi Shore has called the ornamental. If we want to preserve the idea that close reading means analyzing details meticulously so as to avoid generalization and misapprehension, we need to direct our meticulousness to all aspects of the literary work, and we will need to understand details to include all of those elements that have gone without saying or without seeing. We should pay attention to small details, Gallup has proposed, not to understand the text better, but to find in the text new aspects of its incomprehensibility. To read closely for Gallup is to acknowledge and cultivate our incomplete understanding. In The Thousand Autumns, Mitchell yokes the ethics of incomprehensibility to the politics of translation. We have to regard the chapters as if they are foreign, full of conversations that are partial, inaccessible, and in need of careful interpretation. But we also have to regard them as actually foreign, testimony to the regional, global, and maritime histories of the Pacific. We have to be close readers because we need to notice that the text doesn't fit one period, one nation, or one language. But it also doesn't fit one object, and in this sense, we can't only be close readers. We have to think about the many collectivities produced by the narrative structure, the traveling books, the orphaned characters, and the multiple languages. The closest of readers, Mitchell suggests, are the Dutch and Japanese officers who think they can keep their localities intact. Instead, Mitchell proposes the novel takes place among a network of localities that are irreducible both to nation and to globe. We have to consider how that network changes what we know of Britain, Holland, and Japan, and how it changes the way we think about world fiction in English. Books that revel in someone else's language alert us to the dynamics of foreignness and fluency that operate in any literary work. They also give us the opportunity to generate ways of reading that do not simply repeat those dynamics. By adding the history of translation to the history of the novel, we make a start. Thank you.